Hey all, it's Starzy, and today we are wrapping up September and October. If you follow me on TikTok or Instagram, you may have some idea what I've been up to. I've been pretty busy recently. That's why it's been a couple of months since we just kind of sat down and chatted, I think. In September in particular, I went away with my family, and then in October I started the month off with PAX, which was amazing. I got to meet so many lovely people, got to spend time with so many friends, both old and new, and it was just a really great time. It was also my first time going to PAX, which is a gaming convention here if you're not aware. And I also cosplayed all 3 days, so it was so much fun. And then I continued to be busy with various events all throughout October, including of course like spooky season celebrations. So it's been a busy time. I also once again successfully watched 31 spooky movies for the 31 days of October, which I like to do every year. But I did also manage to read some things along the way. So that's what we're going to be doing. Let's get right into talking about some of the things that I've been reading recently. Alright, the first thing I actually finished off in September, which had been kind of reading on and off for months, but it was the Game of Thrones and philosophy, which I've talked about a bunch of these philosophy books before. They have little kind of short essays by various people to do with philosophy and geared towards like a particular pop culture thing. You know, like I've read the Batman. I've talked about the Batman one in the past, and I think one or two others. So this is the Game of Thrones one. This is probably my favorite of the philosophy books I've read so far in this genre. Still, you know, they don't go into as much depth as perhaps I would like sometimes and all that kind of stuff. But I think Game of Thrones in particular is a series that really lends itself to these kind of philosophical conversations. There's kind of a lot to unpack and discuss, and so I found this one particularly interesting. I think I did still give it like 3 stars because again, it doesn't always go into as much depth, and also because there's so many different authors with so many different viewpoints, you're not necessarily going to agree with everything everyone's saying, but it has been my favorite of those. Then we get into the things that I finished while I was away. First being Babel, the Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. That's a mouthful. By R.F. Kuang. This is probably one of the most hyped books of the year that I've seen. Unpopular opinion, I kind of just thought it was okay. Basically, this is, you know, a dark academia book, and it has a lot of interesting things that it's discussing because it's particularly looking at, you know, it's particularly kind of a criticism of academia, as true dark academia usually are, but also particularly kind of the racial politics that come into that, because we are following our main character is of Chinese descent, at least in part, and the people he meets up with and befriends in this academic society are mostly non-white as well, and so there's a lot of stuff there that's being unpacked, and you've got like people who are kind of revolting against academia and society and all that kind of stuff. And it's also a fantasy in that there's this underlying thing of, I think it's silver. It's been a couple of months since I've read this now, but I think it's silver is the main thing in this world that's like a huge commodity, and you can like make magic from it and stuff. And particularly like our main characters in this book are like learning to work with that because it's very much language based. The way it works. So there's all these interesting concepts and interesting discussions to have that I did really appreciate what the book was trying to do in that way. What I found was that I didn't love it as a narrative, and I wasn't really connecting to any of the characters because in a lot of ways there's because there's this overarching plot and discussions that are trying to be had. I often felt like we didn't spend enough time with the characters and exploring the characters in a way that you would actually care about them beyond this political stuff. So I don't know, it just didn't work for me entirely as a narrative, and so that's why I thought like interesting things were going on, and it was like, as I said, it was okay, but that's why I like didn't love it, I guess. I also bought a couple of things while I was away and read those before I came home, one of which was Basketful of Heads by Joe Hill. So this is a comic book, and as the title suggests, there is a basket full of heads that's involved. Because it's, you know, it's quite short, I don't feel like I want to say too much about it other than like it's a horror story and there's a basket full of heads. I did enjoy this for the most part. There are definitely like criticisms to be had, and it's not necessarily my favorite art style, and there were particularly some panels that the way they were drawn, I could see what they were trying to do, but it also just looked really weird. But as like a story, it was interesting, but I don't know, it was like fine. I can't remember, I probably gave this 3 stars. The way some things were approached wasn't my favorite, but like, it was an interesting read to have, you know, when I was hanging around in the hotels and stuff. Other thing I got while I was away, which I actually ended up loving, other than the ending, that's Wilder Girls by Rory Power. This is a YA horror, and this has a lot of like body horror involved. We've got this like boarding school that has been overrun by some kind of like virus or something, and they're in quarantine because it's like affecting all their bodies so dramatically, and you know, the government and whatever doesn't want it to get out and spread. So they're quarantined like in this area where this school is, and you know, some of them have died and some of them have had weird things happen to their body, like growing 2 spines or scales or various things like this. So really interesting from the get-go. There were also some interesting like character dynamics, and it was interesting just kind of getting to know exactly what was happening and who we could trust and all of that kind of stuff. So all throughout this book, I was like thoroughly engaged and loving it. The only thing that let this down for me was the ending, which I'm not someone who necessarily feels like I need an entirely conclusive ending, but this was left so open and it kind of just felt like it suddenly stopped. So the ending was pretty unsatisfying in a number of ways, but all up till then, I'd loved this book. So overlooking that, it was a good time. I also finished listening to Ruby Fever by Ilona Andrews in September, which is the recent installment in the Hidden Legacy series, which is a series I absolutely love. I've said before, like the original kind of trilogy and the story arc that had is still like my favorite, but I've still really enjoyed following this arc as well. 6 books in a series. I can't tell you much about it other than the fact that the world is an urban fantasy world where a lot of people have powers, and these powers are very much linked to kind of the hierarchy of families and society in a number of ways. And the family that we follow throughout are like private investigators. I love the family dynamics, and I found the world and all of that really interesting. And they're also books that definitely have a romance element to them as well, although the way the covers would make you think these are straight up romance books, and I would argue that they're not. There's definitely romance in them, but it comes secondary to like the plot and everything else that's going on. But there's a romance you follow in the first 3 books, and then another romance that you follow in like the next 3 books. But yeah, I did really enjoy this as an installment to the series, and I would recommend it. I also listened to Into the Drowning Deep by Mira in September, and this was my 1 5-star of the month. I loved this, which I had high expectations for it anyway, because I'd actually listened to the novella before this, which some people argue you shouldn't do and you should read them in publishing order, but I just happened to get access to the novella before the full book. This is another horror, and this involves like killer mermaids. So basically the setup for this is that some years ago a ship went out into the sea to film a documentary about mermaids, and the ship never came back, and so we are now following a new crew going out there to kind of prove once and for all what's actually out there, what actually happened, etc., etc. And yeah, shiz goes down. There's something really creepy to me about being like trapped out on the ocean in general, let alone when you have these killer creatures involved, so I liked this a lot. There's also like various representation in this, like both disability and like queerness, and it's just a good time. On a slightly less positive note, the last thing I finished in September, Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn, and this is a thriller, and we're following a woman who goes back home to the small town that she's from because her bosses told her to go there to investigate because she's a journalist and some children have been killed or gone missing in this small town. And stuff goes from there. To some extent, I have mixed feelings about this book because there were some things that were definitely interesting about it. But it got to a point where the only reason I was still reading was just because I wanted to know exactly how it was all going to wrap up. Otherwise, I was like, do I really want to continue reading this? There were a number of things that got to me, from some of it just not being necessarily that interesting the way it was written, to particularly there being some aspects of how it was written and terminology that was used that was particularly like outdated. I mean, this isn't like a new book, so that perhaps that excuses some of it, but still the way it spoke about a number of groups of people made me uncomfortable. And also, yeah, the way some things unfolded in general was just a bit weird to me. I mean, like, why are you, an adult woman, going and doing drugs with your like young teen sister, for one? That whole scene and everything that unfolded was like very strange. I also kind of called who I thought was responsible for some stuff that was going on pretty early. And I don't know, I think I gave this 2 stars. Like, there were some interesting things, but like overall, Then we get to October and I read Upgrade by Blake Crouch. This is the new Blake Crouch book. I've really enjoyed his like sci-fi thrillers I've read before this, so this was something I was really looking forward to reading. And it's another thing I gave 2 stars. The problem with some of these books that I didn't like so much is that I've just never thought of them again since I've read them, so let me try and recall what was going on. The concept of this revolves around the fact that like editing DNA and that type of science has been like outlawed because of some things that happened in the past, but we're following someone whose job is basically to track down and capture people who have like gone against this. And in one of these raids, he gets like infected with something and his DNA starts to change, and then he's being accused of like doing it on purpose, and things kind of like unravel from there as you find out like what's really going on, etc, etc. Can I remember why I really didn't like this? I think part of it was just that it was the least interesting of all of the books I've read by Blake Crouch at this point. And honestly, like, yeah, I've never thought about this book again since I finished it, so I don't have in-depth thought for you because this was like, what, over a month ago. Just know I didn't find it all that interesting and I didn't really like it. There were probably other things beyond that, but they are now gone from my head. I also listened to The Society for Soulless Girls by Laura Stephen. I think this had a college setting where there were some girls going to this school and there was kind of some weird stuff going on, and like someone had like committed suicide in the past, and there was kind of this creepy, there was kind of these like spooky vibes going on, and like, is something mystical going on or is it not, and some stuff like that. And this book was fine. I think I did give it 3 stars. It was fine, nothing particularly special, nothing particularly like new and exciting compared to, all of the books I've read at this point. It was kind of just fine. It was kind of just fine, and I didn't love everything about it. Again, it's a book I felt not much for at the time, so I haven't thought about it since. So I also got to read an arc of Lost in the Moment and Found, which is Wayward Children number 8 by Seanan McGuire. This doesn't come out till January, but I was so excited to be approved for an arc because I remember last year I was rejected from getting the arc for the new Wayward Children book, but this year I was very excited, and so I got on reading it pretty quickly despite how long it is until it comes out. This is a series following like children who go through doors to other worlds, and some of them follow and some of the books follow them kind of dealing with the consequences of being back in our world, and some of them follow the actual journeys that some of them have been on. This one is one of those ones that could kind of be read as a standalone because we're following a character going through a door. but there are also like some hints and nice connections to other books. And I really liked this one. This is already like one of my favorite series, although some of them I definitely haven't loved as much as others. I think I gave this one 4 stars. It's not like my favorite, but it is like, it was pretty decent. Another thing with this is that like these books have such a like kind of whimsical, magical sense to them, but they're often also dealing with quite heavy topics. And this was definitely one of those where in a lot of ways this was a very sad book. And there was some really, you know, there were some hard-hitting things that were kind of being explored in it, as well as having those hints of magic. But yeah, I really liked this. So if you've read the rest of the Wayward Children books and you've enjoyed them, like definitely pick this one up next year. I also just love the way these books are written, like especially all the other ones I've like listened to, and there's something about them that just makes me feel like I'm listening to a fairy tale. Then we get into anticipated reads that were really disappointing. The Restless Dark by Erica Waters. Erica Waters' previous 2 books I've really enjoyed, particularly the book that came out last year was like one of my favorite books of that year. They're usually like YA horror, although this one's probably leaning more towards that kind of like mystery thriller vibes perhaps. But I loved her previous books, so this was one of my most anticipated books of the year. I didn't like it. Where do I start with this? So the whole concept of this is a girl was a survivor of a serial killer, basically. She was kind of found just in time when she happened to kind of be captured by this serial killer, and so the killer ended up kind of like jumping off a cliff instead of being captured. So she's known as the survivor. And on the other hand, there is currently this competition going on that a podcast is running to kind of find the bones of this killer. And she goes there to this competition as a way of trying to kind of get over the trauma that she has. So that's what's going on with her, and then we also have a couple of other characters and they have their own reasons for being there. I guess I had a few problems with this. One problem I had was that I called who was responsible and what was going on very early on, which made everything else that happened after that all the more annoying and frustrating for me, especially because the girls seemed to be going along with certain conclusions based on like no evidence, and there didn't seem to be any reason for them to actually be thinking this. And then it went to the extreme beyond that, where they were like prepared to kill someone based on no evidence, etc., etc. And because I could see what was happening, it made me all the more angry. Like what, like how, why, this doesn't make sense. So that was one thing that was just constantly annoying me, of like, I can see what's going on. You're all being so stupid. Like, do none of you have even like one brain cell between you? And I guess also it just like wasn't as interesting, particularly compared to some of her previous books. There was a lot of just like people talking and not a lot like actually happening. But yeah, mostly I was just annoyed at how the plot was unfolding, because it seemed like, yeah, there were a number of things about the way it was plotted that just annoyed me. Like, I still like her writing, and you know, the concept had, you know, some promise, but overall I just did not like how it was executed at all. And one of the characters I hated so much, which, you know, probably contributing factor, again, I could see what was happening, but one of them I hated so much and I just didn't want to read it. Yeah, so it was so disappointing. I'm so sad. I'm sure there's an audience out there, like people will like it, and I've definitely seen like still good reviews of it and stuff, but to me personally, like, I just really didn't like it, and I'm so sad. Like, it isn't my most disappointing book of the year, probably. And that's actually it. That's everything I've read over the past couple of months. The only other thing I've read I finished this month, so we'll talk about it next time. A sour note to end on. Anyway, I hope you've all been well. Let me know what you've been reading. Let me know what one of your favorite books that you've read recently has been. I guess I've had a pretty mixed reading experience over the past couple of months. There's been some books I really didn't like, some I was really disappointed by, but also some things I mostly liked and some that I even loved. So It's been a big mix of things, but let me know what you've been reading, what you've been up to, how have you been, and yeah, don't forget to follow me on my other socials because I tend to be much more active there. TikTok is probably where I post the most regularly, but I've also been posting more to Instagram, and I'm usually on Twitch once a week as well, so come hang out with me sometime if you want to see my face more than like once every month or two. But otherwise, yeah, have a good day. Starzy out and TTFN.